Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. And in today's video I would like to talk to you about Ukrainian nationalism and especially what I remember about the rise of Ukrainian nationalism in the late 80s during the perestroika and glasnost time under Gorbachev rule. If you follow my channel, you probably remember that I was born in 1971, so I was 20 in 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved. So I remember really well, and also I kept a diary about events that preceded the resurgence of Ukrainian nationalism in the late 1980s. But before we start, I would like to remind you that Soviet Union had this interesting game going on. While they were supporting actively any national freedom movements outside the country, especially in the West, they heavily suppressed any nationalist movement inside of the Soviet Union, and it was called bourgeois nationalism. So anything going on in Ukraine was bourgeois nationalism. You had to say that word. There was a term coined by Lenin. And of course, KGB was heavily involved in monitoring and persecuting any nationalist movements in Ukraine and probably other republics. I know mostly about Ukraine. But of course, my family, my friends, we never knew about those events because, KGB was doing it for a long time. So they knew where to look for troublemakers, just like fishermen. If you are looking for salmon, you don't go to the swamp because you can only find catfish. So if you're looking for nationalists, you don't look for the blue collar. Usually the troublemakers were in universities, in colleges, among the writers. And so that's what they were monitoring and harassing and arresting people in Ukraine. There will be writers, journalists, historians, and professors. And of course, there was plenty of anti-Ukrainian nationalism propaganda in Ukraine. I remember this Ukrainian language humor magazine called Peret, the Pepper, and this is the issue from January of 1979. And it's two girls wearing a Ukrainian national dress on the right and Russian national dress on the left, with other nationalities in the background cheering, and they're holding the wreath with the words 325 years. So that's 325 years since 1654, when Russia and Ukraine, Russian Tsar and Ukrainian Hetman signed agreement of becoming allies. And below it says, Nasha Vichna Druzhba, our forever friendship. And below it says, Yich Sobacha Sluzhba, Ich dogs service. So they're barking like dogs. So there's a fat capitalist hand holding a bunch of liars. And the guy on the right, he's wearing a hat with the blue and yellow colors, which considers being nationalist Ukrainian colors, and they just barking lies towards the forever friendship between Russia and Ukraine. And this magazine periodically, not all the time, but usually for the specific dates, for example, celebrating October Revolution, like this issue from Listopad, so that's October of 1982. And as you see, there's a 1917 number and a 7 made as the shtick, my goodness, I forgot the English word for it, bayonet. So on the bayonet, on the top, is Ukrainian nationalist with the trident and once again, blue and yellow national Ukrainian colors. What I find extremely interesting that contrary to the modern days Russian propaganda that tries to portray Ukrainian nationalists as hardcore anti-Semite movement, talking about thousands and thousands of Jews that Ukrainian nationalists killed in the Western Ukraine, during the Soviet days, Ukrainian nationalists were portrayed like the best buddies with Israel Zionists, and it reflected heavily on these caricatures. This caricature is probably one of my favorites. We have two guys, Ukrainian nationalist and Israeli Zionist, pulling together a horse-dragging wagon, voz, that says Anti-Radyanshina, anti-Sovietism, and the person in the wagon is Holodna Vina, Cold War. And she's frozen with the gun instead of the nose, and she's holding a hydrogen bomb. And of course, the extremely interesting part is a decoration on the top of the, I don't know how to that word in English, above the guys. It's Ukrainian trident combined with the Star of David. It's very impressive. And of course, they have American dollars, coins hanging below as a decoration. If that's what they get paid to do. So yeah, that's an interesting combination of joint efforts to promote anti-Sovietism and Cold War by Ukrainian nationalists and Israeli Zionists. Here's another one, and you gotta give a credit to the creator of this caricature, because to come up with this concept of a two-headed snake that forms the letter S and two knives that complete the picture to show who pays for these guys, American dollar, and I think I need to explain you that on the bottom is Ukrainian nationalist. There's a Ukrainian trident, and on the top, of course, that's the Israeli Zionist with the Star of David. Here's another one, and I just need to remind you, all of them came from the Ukrainian language magazine Peretz. So here you got the Israeli soldier partying with Ukrainian nationalist and drinking anti-Radyanshina Kool-Aid. Well, it's not a Kool-Aid, of course, but yeah, they're drinking anti-Sovietism. That's what it says on the bottles. And Ukrainian guy has a microphone which says Svoboda, which means freedom. So he is the member of the Voices of the Enemies, an enemy radio station called Svoboda, Freedom. That was one of the radio stations that was telling lies about Soviet Union. And of course, we had a lot of caricatures reminding us that Ukrainian nationalist movements were paid by Uncle Sam. So there were a lot of pictures where Ukrainian nationalists look like beggars asking for money from United States. Or it's going to be a combination of Uncle Sam and Ukrainian nationalists and Israeli Zionists, like little kids sitting on his laps and getting paid for their horrible deeds. So one can only imagine what kind of emotions were running in Kremlin, like in Vladimir Putin's minds. I don't know about Yeltsin, when newly independent Ukraine back in 1991 adopted blue and yellow colors for its flag and trident for its symbol, which was always in Russian propaganda and Soviet propaganda, was always Nazi, bourgeois, nationalist colors and symbols. Okay, now back to my personal story. A while back, I made a video about relations between Russians and Ukrainians, what I remember, and if you missed that story, a link will be below in the comment section. Back in the 80s, probably close to 50% of my friends were Russians. Most of them were actually military family. So just like an American military, Soviet officers moved quite a bit from one town to another from different military bases. And a lot of military outfits were located right in the large cities like Kiev or Moscow. So they just came and settled in Kiev and they end up never moving again. So yeah, I had one of my best friends were actually Russians. But of course, when you move from Moscow to Kiev back in the 80s, there was not much difference or cultural shock for Russian people because Kiev was pretty much at that time Russian language city. Signages were mostly in Russian language. Announcements on trams or subways were in Russian. Most schools were Russian-speaking schools, so all the subjects will be in Russian. Whereas I don't know, maybe less than 10% there were Ukrainian language schools when they taught subjects in Ukrainian. I only studied Ukrainian language and literature, I think, between the 4th grade to the 8th grade. Then we continued to study Russian language and literature, but we stopped studying Ukrainian language and literature. And those Russian kids, they could get a waiver and not to study Ukrainian at all. So the only difference would be that we spoke a little bit of different Russian language, so-called Южно-Российский говор. So that's like a southern Russian accent. So instead of что, we say шо. And a couple other little things. Instead of hard g, we will say h. That's why in modern Ukrainian, a lot of g in English spelling changed to H. So from Golodomor and changed to Holodomor and stuff like that. So besides accent, I mean, we were almost like Russia. And I remember my teacher of Russian language, Elizaveta Sergeyevna, who was originally from Ural Mountains, and she was, teaching me Russian for will be 6 years. She complained that she has to go for the summer break back to Russia to restore her proper way of speaking, because spending that much time in Kiev would corrupt her language, and she will start speaking with Ukrainian sho and with soft g. So I remember that was kind of shocked because I never realized that we spoke improper Russian. Sure, we still had Ukrainian language media, so we had Ukrainian language radio stations. I remember Promeny. We had one Ukrainian TV station, I believe it was one. We had a total of 3 channels available, and one was Ukrainian television, UT, Odin, I think. Don't remember exactly. So there was still Ukrainian language going on, but was slowly choked off. For example, our main local newspaper, Evening Kyiv, Вечерний Kyiv, was published in both languages, Russian and Ukrainian. Once again, I already made a couple of videos on the topic of Russification of Ukraine, and if by any chance you missed it, link also will be below in the comment section. So while Eastern and Central Ukraine, including capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, was pretty much completed project of Russification, Western Ukraine was completely different story. I mentioned many times in my videos that I never considered myself either Ukrainian or Russian. I consider myself Soviet of Ukrainian descent, and it was, pretty odd combination. I was an Ukrainian whose first language was Russian, and I was pretty fluent in Ukrainian. The only problem could be some unusual words. I'll have to say them in Russian because I don't know how to say them in Ukrainian. I still can speak Ukrainian pretty well right now, but now I'll be tripping and using English words instead of the words that I just don't remember how to say in Ukrainian. If you read my book American Diaries 1995, I described that first time when I experienced this bizarre situation when I was trying to speak Ukrainian in New York when I met a Ukrainian lady in the airport, and trying to be nice, so I started speaking Ukrainian to her, and to my horror, so that was probably about 3 months I spent in the United States, so I'm speaking Ukrainian to her, and then I'm tripping and I'm using English words when I couldn't say the word in Ukrainian, and that was so bizarre because like my brain thinking one thing but my mouth says another thing, and it was really embarrassing and weird. It's the first time when I was substituting Ukrainian words with English words. Okay, back to the topic of the Western Ukraine. So as I said, I consider myself Soviet of Ukrainian descent. But people who lived in the Western Ukraine, we didn't call them Ukrainians. The word was used Zapadenцы. I don't know if it came from Russia, but it means the Westerners. Like they had a slightly or quite a bit different culture, Ukrainian culture. They spoke different Ukrainian language with different accent, and they used a lot of words that we didn't use in the regular Ukrainian language. For example, velociped, bicycle, they would call rover. Instead of fire, vogony, they will say vatra. So they had quite a few foreign words in their Western Ukrainian language, and you could always tell when there was a Western Ukrainian speaking. Their Ukrainians sound quite different. And that was a general understanding, and we had a lot of anecdotes, a lot of jokes on this topic, that Zapadenцы, the Westerners, were never real Soviets. They still were despising Soviet regime, Soviet government. They still wanted to be independent, and we had a lot of jokes, and they were kind of like friendly jokes admitting that those guys are unbreakable, about these old Ukrainian grandpas that are still secretly rebels, and they are part of resistance. There's one example. So the Western Ukraine and the local pioneers, young pioneers, see this bizarre scene. Old grandpa is pouring the lubricating oil on his front yard over his flowers, and they're like, "Hey grandpa, are you crazy? You're gonna kill your flowers." And grandpa replies, "I don't care about flowers, I just want to make sure my machine guns are not gonna get rusty." There's another one, similar topic, young pioneers and old men in the Western Ukraine, and they question him, "Is that true that you're hiding a machine gun somewhere in your house?" "Oh, those are lies." "We heard the rumors that up in the hills in the old barn you hide a German tank. Is that true?" "No, all those are lies." And they keep on asking about cannon, all that stuff. And then one kid, "Well, I heard that in your well you're hiding a submarine. Is that true?" And grandpa loses his patience. "Okay, kids, this is one thing that I don't have for sure." In Ukrainian it sounds better. He says, "Чого нема, того нема." And one more. So there's 2 Western Ukrainians sitting on the bank of the river, and they see a guy drowning and screaming in Russian, "Помогите, спасите!" So help, help. And one Ukrainian guy looked at another one. "You see that, buddy? Instead of learning how to swim, he was learning enemy's language." So despite the efforts of communist propaganda, most of the people at that time in 1980s, so among my friends and my family, there was no like negative really attitude towards Ukrainian nationalism. It was more just like a neutral, humorous attitude, and it didn't make anybody mad and angry like it happening right now in modern day Russia. And that's how we were telling each other those jokes, starting in Russian and then switching to Ukrainian language with Western Ukraine accent to make it even more funnier. And as I mentioned earlier, in the 80s, Kiev was pretty much a Russian speaking city. And if you hear Ukrainian language on the street, usually assume that someone came out of town. And they managed, and I talked about it in my other videos, they managed to create the image that if you speak Ukrainian, not Russian, you're kind of like a redneck. You're out of some hills and you came to town and you still speak Ukrainian. Like my parents, they came from the villages, and the first thing they did when they arrived to Kiev in the late 1960s, they switched to Russian language. And Soviet government did invent that strategy. Before them, Russian government, so before Revolution 1917, had the same approach in Ukraine. If you want your kid to be educated, you need to teach him Russian. And if you speak Ukrainian, you're a seluk, so you're like a villager. And what changed the situation was, of course, perestroika and most of it glasnost. So glasnost can be translated as openness. It should be just called freedom of speech. But if you announce freedom of speech, that means before, people in the Soviet Union didn't have freedom of speech. So Gorbachev chose this word glasnost. And the idea, I believe, was that we need to be more open about our failures and provide criticism, then we can improve and be better as society. So that was, I think, general idea about glasnost, but of course it went downhill from there in a completely wrong direction. And I remember the very first time there was a conversation in my class. So I was still in school, we can call it high school. I believe I was in 9th grade, so that's 1987. So still, several years away from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we were at the geography class, and our teacher, she was Russian. And besides learning about, capitals of the world and different countries, we also studied, I don't know how to say it in English, but it's about economical relations in our country. So you're studying, okay, so this territory, it's Donbass, for example. So there's a heavy industry, depends on coal, that needs coal, and then ore. And this is how our economy is built in the regions. So during that discussion, someone started bringing up that Ukraine will be better off without Soviet Union on its own. And it was a big discussion because teacher was trying to prove us that it's better for Ukraine to be part of the Soviet Union because that's how economical ties are and exchange, goods. We all kind of tied up together energetically, energy, like electricity wise, and sending back and forth products and supplies. And I remember kids had arguments with her, quite heated argument, that Ukraine will be way better on its own because we produce so much food, especially. I remember one kid saying that salo, so pork fat, that we could feed the world and have way better life than we have to feed Moscow right now. Then right downtown Kiev, by the main postal office, Glavpochtamt, we started seeing people. I believe they were coming from Western Ukraine, and there was a real nationalist. And they were selling, there was older people, and they were selling brochures and, stickers with the colors of Ukrainian flag, yellow and blue, which at that time was still illegal, badges, flags, and a bunch of literature. And people were buying it and learning about history of Ukrainian nationalism. And police, militia didn't bother them. So that was kind of like the final stage when a lot of people started thinking about Ukraine being independent and being under flags of own organization of Ukrainian nationalists. Then there were people on the streets issuing temporary IDs if you want to be a citizen of Ukrainian People's Republic, which was created originally back in 1918 in Kiev. And then in 1922, the Bolsheviks created their own socialist Ukraine with the capital in Kharkiv in 1922. And then we had so-called civil war once again. Moscow was sending troops and Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR, the National Republic, lost, and that's how Ukraine became Soviet. And I guess the idea was if they get enough signatures, enough people signing up as the citizens of Ukrainian People's Republic, then there'll be a legal way of separating Ukraine from the Soviet Union and turning it back to UNR, Ukrainian People's Republic. And another interesting thing I remember, so right downtown Kiev in Krishchatik, we have a city council. At that time, everyone was called Gorsovet, so it's in Russian, Городской Совет, so city Soviet. And of course, they had a red Ukrainian flag with the blue line below, so that was a like Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic flag. And one time there was a big group of people, almost like a little demonstration, and they took down the Soviet Ukraine flag and they raised blue and yellow flag. And militia was fighting them and they ripped the flag down. So I remember those early, I think it was like 1990 at that time, when the first time they raised the future flag of independent Ukraine, and it was actually like fighting over it. And now, of course, it's what there is up there, a Ukrainian flag, yellow and blue. And then things got totally out of control, and not in Ukraine, but it began with Baltic states, so it's Estonian, Lithuanian, and Latvian Soviet Socialist republics. They declared their independence, so-called Parad Suverenitetov, the Parade of Sovereignties. I think I said it right, maybe not. So Estonia declared its cession from the Soviet Union in May 8, 1990, then Lithuania in March 1990, then Latvia in May of 1990, and it was recognized on September 6, 1991, and then it went downhill from there, and Ukraine was quite behind on that. It's basically on December 26, 1991, when Soviet Union was officially kissed goodbye. That's when Ukraine, along with Russia and Belarus, became independent as well. And most of my friends and I were excited about Ukraine becoming independent, and I guess we were slightly Ukrainian nationalists as well, but we never bothered to switch to Ukrainian language and forget Russian language. All my friends remained Russian speaking till recent events. And in fact, one of my friends, my former classmate, and he was hardcore, he was real Russian. His parents came from Murom region in Russia, and you could still hear accent. They were kind of like, had louder than normal for us. And now he's more nationalist than I am. He switched completely to Ukrainian language, and he's a Russian nationality person. He speaks Ukrainian only. He married back then Ukrainian lady, and he participated in defending of Kiev when Russians came close. So yeah, he's a hardcore Ukrainian nationalist now. It's pretty wild, because I remember him, if I would think of any of my friends who were the most Russian back in 80s, that was Igor. And now he's more nationalist than I am, and I'm born Ukrainian, but of course never become nationalist. Well, anyways, this is what I remember about the rise of Ukrainian nationalism in Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. I hope you find this story interesting. If you did, please don't forget to like it, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.